My purpose today is to introduce the subject of Cost Schedule Control Systems Criteria, SCSC. I'd like to tell you a little bit about how it came about, what was the rationale behind it, and more importantly, I want to talk about how it in fact fits into a total financial management reporting structure. It's important to understand that and not hold out CSC as an entity all by itself. It is in fact part of a more total picture of how financial management is handled within the acquisition business. About 25 years ago, in the mid-60s, the Department of Defense, or the program offices within Defense, were being criticized rather severely by the Congress and others on poor management, poor estimating capability, and the fact that we were getting a lot of surprises on programs, that is, cost surprises, overruns. You might say, what's new? We still hear that same criticism today. But in order to attack that problem, or try and help resolve that problem, we launched off on a series of activities. And there were several separate but related activities that occurred at the same time. And I'd like to step through each one of those with you. The first was the development of a uniform way of getting funding data from the industry. We somehow had to go out and get in some uniform fashion, because everybody was doing it with a different reporting structure, get into uniform fashion so it could be summarized to be used for justifying the funding in the 5-year defense plan and also in our submissions to the Congress. The Contract Funds Status Report was developed to do that job, and it still is doing that job today. The second piece of that was of the total structure was an effort to try and improve rather substantially our cost estimating capability within defense. OSD office, the comptroller's office, took responsibility for this, and the 3 services were working on the program. There was developed a series of reports, contract cost data summary, which you're familiar with, and that broke out into functional cost hour reports, hardware cost, and also to learning curve information. All of this, of course, was needed to develop the estimating relationships, the cost models that were needed to enhance if we were going to enhance our cost estimating capability on our major programs in defense. Those reports are still being used today. The third leg of this was the day-to-day performance of the ongoing contract. How was our particular contractor behaving? How was he performing compared to what he should have been doing? And for that, the cost performance report was developed. It was a standard report developed where there had been none before. It had on it the plan of what the work was to be done. It required a report against the actuals, of course, and also introduced an earned value concept on that report. What we planned to do, what we actually accomplished, and what it cost us to accomplish it. And it had on it an estimated completion. Hopefully that was going to give us some visibility on what was happening on the instant contract or the instant program. So those 3 reports were developed as a total financial management reporting structure. As we were doing that, it became readily apparent that there was not only a single structure that was being used to get the information from an individual contractor, but it seemed to make a lot of sense to get the same kind of information from all contractors. This was brought on about mainly for the cost estimating community. If we could somehow standardize those structures, we could then have a much better handle on building a database from which to develop our estimating relationships and our cost models. DDR&E back then, another element of the Office of Secretary of Defense, took on that task And the three services worked as a part of that overall group. The Air Force, of course, was assigned aircraft and large missiles, as I recall, and the Navy was assigned shipbuilding and small missiles, and the Army was assigned things like track vehicles, tanks, and so forth. The logical breakout for the hardware, the weapons that we were responsible for anyway. As we developed these work breakdown structures and tried to standardize them, it fell together a lot faster and a lot smoother than we had thought, because we already had programming documents for which we submitted funding data that was in fact broken out the way a work breakdown structure was broken out. The primary mission equipment, the peculiar support equipment that we had, the training equipment that we might have, the data that had to be reported, all became the contract line items. And as we broke those further on down, there was a natural breakout for the supporting elements. So the development of the work breakdown structure got to be a very important step in that whole equation of uniform reporting and reporting that was useful and meaningful, one report to the other: funding, cost information, and performance information. Now, if we were to look at some of that data that we got back, cast yourself back 25 years, some of it was very good, some of it was very useful, and some of it was pure garbage. Not very useful, because it came from a system that didn't represent the way the work was being done. It came from a system that really reported out of the top of whatever the contractor was using internally. It didn't emanate from the same system. In order to resolve that problem, we decided to look at cost, schedule, information systems, control systems in a contractor's plant. And while we were doing that, it became apparent that there were several program offices that had already imposed sort of standard systems, standard way of managing defense programs on industry. PERT cost was one of those schemes that was used back in those days, imposed on the contractor. Didn't represent the way he was doing the work, and therefore the data that came out of it couldn't very well represent the way the program was being managed. So we decided, instead of specifying a particular system, we would write a system specification, the criteria, if we will. We would outline some basic criteria that a contractor's internal system should meet, and we would then evaluate his system against that standard. If we could do that, if we could in fact get the contractor to provide the data or the information to industry, or from industry to government, based on the same information that he was using to manage his program in-house, then we would have imposed on him nothing outwardly, but merely build on the system that he was using. Or, in many cases, just use the system he was using because he already met many of the requirements of the criteria. So it was important then to take a look at what those criteria were going to look like. And the criteria themselves had to, of necessity, be very broad. And yet they had to be specific enough to outline what we thought the fundamental characteristics of a good cost schedule planning control system should look like. Now, what we did in this case was to outline 5 basic criteria, and they were broken down into, or 5 areas, I should say, in the criteria. They were broken down fundamentally into organization. Can the contractor define the work effort, and does he assign responsibility for doing the work? Does he have an organization that permits him to do that? Planning and budgeting. Does he have a system that plans the work and budgets for the work? Does he schedule the work? Does he then have a system for, his accounting system, for accumulating or collecting the cost? Does he have a system to analyze the data? And finally, does he have an approach for incorporating revisions and providing estimates of completion, reporting to the government and reporting to his own management? And those were essentially the basic criteria. And you can shred out the various aspects of each of those 5 functional areas, but those were the basic criteria. While we got information in government on hardware, because this is what we had to justify to the Congress. We had to justify the system. We managed that program. We managed the different hardware and the different inputs from the different hardware contractors. We budgeted for the hardware for that system. But in fact, the contractor manages people. He managed functions, doing work on our hardware or on the contract. And so we had to look at the contractor's organization to see where there was a natural break of where the organization intersected with the contract line items. And that natural break then got identified within his internal system, was further broken down into work packages, and at that work package level, the work was assigned, it was planned, it was scheduled, it was authorized, we collected cost against it, we measured performance against it, and we summed it up and reported at some higher level, all based on what was going on at that work package. It's important to recognize what the fundamentals are at that level. And if I look at a particular package, or how I wanted to look at that or display it graphically, I would see a line that in a cum sense showed the plan for all of the work to be performed. And at a given point in time, I would collect actuals against it, and I would collect also against it what was accomplished, what he earned. And the difference between what he earned and what he actually spent would give me this cost variance. And the difference between what he planned to do and what he actually did, or what he earned, would give me the schedule variance. And from that, I could make a valid estimate at completion. I would always know where I was in relationship to the contract and at any point in time. And if I sum these up for all of the work packages that I had, all of the cost accounts that I might have, then I would get the total contract performance. And it got to be, to us, a very powerful tool on managing an individual program. It provided the visibility that we needed to be able to foretell some things in time to do something about it, something that we didn't have before. As we went on to implement the program, what we found was the Army sort of taking off on our particular effort and doing a similar thing, and then the Navy coming on board. We did this on an informal basis. We decided to get together on an informal basis to work out a kind of a uniform approach on how you would handle the criteria in implementing them across the broad spectrum of the defense industry. As a result of that, we developed a guide, if you will, an implementation guide, we called it, primarily to outline for ourselves what the criteria meant at some more detailed level. And it was to ensure that we provided a uniform implementation across the 3 services. It gave us a basis for understanding. It was kind of a catechism, if you will, sort of questions and answers on what we meant by those various criteria. It was never meant to be the Bible, and that's an important distinction. It's not the criteria. The guide was a guide. The criteria was what was on contract. As the implementation progressed, we ended up with some concerns on the part of industry, which were reported up through the chain to OSD, and there was some concern expressed by OSD that they wanted to regroup, have somebody look at our implementation, and maybe themselves at the OSD level direct how that should be accomplished. In the field, those of us that were doing the implementation didn't think the operation should be at OSD. It should stay at the operating commands, at the buying commands. So the Joint Logistics Commanders entered. These are the commanders of the 4 buying commands in the 3 services, and they sponsored this effort. They sponsored a joint effort to put together in some uniform way the criteria and an implementation procedure that we could all agree to. As we did this, we asked for an audience with the then Deputy Secretary of Defense, who was Dave Packard. And Dave Packard was readily receptive to what we were trying to do. So we ended up briefing Dave Packard. As it turned out, as the chairman of the working group on this, the Joint Logistics Commanders team, I briefed Packard in the presence of the commanders. What we told them was essentially what the criteria's functions were, what they meant, how we had gone about implementing it, and what our problems had been. And our problems basically were one of too specific at lower levels, too detailed implementation, both on the part of the contractor getting too deep in his reporting, and too detailed demand of data on the part of the government. Dave Packard agreed with what we were saying. He agreed with the concept, with the basic rationale. He agreed with the fact that we had identified those things that would cause problems in the industry, and that in fact were not necessary to manage a defense program. He thought the level of detail that some of the implementation had gotten to was not necessary to manage a program in plant, more or less from a program office standpoint. So he directed us to proceed in the way that we had started. He directed us he agreed with us, rather, that we need to raise the level. We had taken the Joint Implementation Guide and made it a Joint Implementation Manual by the time we had gotten to Dave Packard. And we did this because we wanted to impress on him the fact that this was our official document, we were all using it. And at that meeting he said, take that manual and make it a guide. So he put us back to where we had started. He also said to us that we should include in this process DCAA and DLA, DCAS at that time. The people that administer contracts in the plant, they should be part of this review, if there was to be a review. And he also told us at that time that we need to teach the course at the Defense Systems Management School in those days, what is now the Defense Systems Management College. And what you're getting here is the result of that specific direction from Dave Packard. Now, if we put all of this together, if we put together the financial management reporting structure with the fund status, the estimating data, the cost information system, the cost performance report, the performance measurement system, the criteria, and the work breakdown structure, you see that we have a single framework in which to do the total financial management job. We can get information from the contractor system up through each one of those channels. The frequency of reporting is different on each one of those reviews, some quarterly, some monthly, and some semi-annually in contract completion. But we can get the same this information from the same source against the same work breakdown structure. And we have a uniformity of data across the board. We don't impose anything on the contractor other than what he's using already in his internal system, providing it meets some basic criteria. And that same data then is used to not only report through the chain from the program manager up through the Pentagon, justifying his budgets, but it also goes to Congress in the form of budget justification and the selected acquisition report. So while the criteria get to play a key point in assuring the validity of the data in the plant, they are only one piece of the total financial management structure. And I go back to what Dave Packard told us in those days. What we need to do is teach the philosophy and the criteria of the criteria in our program management school so that you understand fully what that concept is and where it fits into the total structure.